and welcome to all of those joining us online from around the world. I'm Beagle, the Director General of the International Development Law Organization, and on behalf of our partners, Sida, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Peru, UN Women, and the Rights and Resources Initiative, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event on feminist climate justice. I think we are all aware that climate change is the greatest long-term threat to peace and sustainable development. The effects can be seen in droughts, heat waves, and forest fires around the world, and science tells us that unless we act urgently now, this is just a taste of things to come. But while this is a global challenge that we all must face together, women and girls are the first and worst hit. Climate change amplifies pre-existing inequalities, placing women at greater risk of climate-related economic, environmental, and social shocks. It disrupts access to land and natural resources, which is central to the lives and livelihoods of many women. And it multiplies the impact of discriminatory laws and practices at a time when women need legal protection the most. This is particularly worrying because in addition to being a human right, the full and equal participation of women and girls is key to resolving the climate crisis. Because data shows us that having more women in government correlates positively with reduced carbon emissions. Societies with higher levels of gender equality also tend to have lower levels of deforestation, air pollution, and loss of natural resources. But despite this, women remain underrepresented at most levels of climate-related governance and decision-making. And this is why a gender-responsive approach to climate justice is an important part of IDLO's new strategic plan. The rule of law is a powerful tool in addressing the climate-gender nexus in three important ways. First, it is key to eliminating the multiple intersecting layers of discrimination that women face. It empowers women to claim their rights and participate in climate decision-making. Second, the rule of law can strengthen institutional capacity and promote more gender-sensitive responses. And third, the rule of law can promote more equitable access to land and resources through formal and informal mechanisms. An explicitly feminist approach to climate action will not only improve the daily lives of women and girls, but also strengthen our collective response to the climate crisis and help build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future. We are lucky to have with us today a great group of people to explore concrete measures to drive change. And before turning to our panel, we're delighted to have two distinguished speakers to set the stage for the discussion. His Excellency, Modesto Montoya, the Minister of Environment of Peru, and Ms. Carin Jämtin, the Director General of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. So firstly, Minister Montoya will provide his opening remarks on video.
Buenas tardes, señora Beagle, Directora General de la Organización Internacional de Derechos para el Desarrollo. Señora Carin Jämtin, Directora General de la Agencia Sueca de Cooperación Internacional para el Desarrollo. Señora Camila Zepeda, Directora General de Asuntos Globales de la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores de México. Estimadas señoras, estimados señores. Me es muy grato darle la bienvenida a todos al evento paralelo Justicia Climática Feminista, empoderando a las mujeres y niñas a través del Estado de Derecho, que el gobierno del Perú tiene el honor de copatrocinar con la Organización Internacional para el Derecho del Desarrollo, la Agencia Sueca de Cooperación Internacional para el Desarrollo, la Iniciativa de Derechos y Recursos y la ONU Mujeres. En nombre del gobierno peruano, tengo el placer de dirigirme a ustedes en esta importante ocasión que nos reúne en este evento y escuchar importantes debates con un excelente panel de expertos, quienes propondrán medidas e iniciativas concretas para empoderar a las mujeres y niñas en el contexto de cambio climático y abordar los desafíos legales y políticos que enfrenta la justicia climática. Asimismo, se reconocerá el papel central de las mujeres en la acción climática y el enfoque del Estado de Derecho como instrumento fundamental para lograr la justicia climática feminista. Permítanme comenzar destacando la relevancia de la Agenda 2030 para el desarrollo sostenible como el marco de política global que brinda una perspectiva clara de interdependencia entre los temas de género, cambio climático y Estado de Derecho, a través de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, ODS, número 5, sobre género y empoderamiento de mujeres y niñas, número 13, sobre acción climática, y número 16, sobre justicia y sociedades pacíficas e inclusivas. La igualdad de género es esencial para el desarrollo sostenible, considerando que es transversal a todos los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible. Por lo tanto, tiene un significado en las oportunidades y derechos de las mujeres y en el progreso de alcanzar los ODS 5, 13 y 16. Nuestras políticas nacionales sobre igualdad de género y el cambio climático deben incluir a las mujeres y todos los sectores de la sociedad a través de amplios canales de participación para fortalecer su legitimidad y la gobernabilidad. En ese sentido, el Perú ha realizado un importante esfuerzo para incorporar el enfoque de género y cambio climático en las políticas públicas alineadas con la Agenda 2030, las cuales requieren una intervención multisectorial en los diferentes niveles de gobierno. Al respecto, puedo mencionar las siguientes políticas públicas. En la 25ª Conferencia de Partes de la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Cambio Climático, se acordó un programa de trabajo de Lima por 5 años sobre género y su plan de acción para promover el conocimiento y la comprensión de género y acción climática. Hemos establecido una política de gobierno al 2026, priorizando las medidas de adaptación al cambio climático y acciones contra riesgos naturales y antrópicos, incorporando el enfoque de género para cerrar brechas históricas de desigualdad. Asimismo, el gobierno peruano declaró la emergencia climática el pasado mes de enero. Esta declaración incorpora temas de justicia climática para garantizar el enfoque de derechos humanos frente a los impactos sociales del cambio climático sobre poblaciones vulnerables y como consecuencia de la pérdida de ecosistemas que constituyen la fuente para su subsistencia y desarrollo. La respuesta al progreso en la justicia climática feminista debe tener como instrumento el fortalecimiento de la política pública. Toda acción emprendida para superar los desafíos tiene un efecto en todos los ámbitos de la sociedad, logrando un avance de los derechos de las mujeres en un marco de Estado de Derecho, contribuyendo a la eliminación de la discriminación contra las mujeres y la desigualdad en sus derechos. Expreso mi agradecimiento a las instituciones involucradas en la organización de este evento y reconocer su labor compartiendo conocimiento, buenas prácticas y experiencias para avanzar en la justicia climática feminista en un marco de Estado de Derecho. Solo lograremos resultados si sumamos esfuerzos para superar los desafíos que comparten las niñas y mujeres en todo el mundo. Muchas gracias.
Tierra solo hay una. Siempre
Thank you
con el
also and
pueblo.
welcome
Gobierno
to the
del
representatives
Perú.
of Peru who are with us
Bicentenario del
today.
Perú 2024.
Now I'm very pleased to welcome Ms. Carin Jämtin, Director General of Sida.
Carlos.
Yeah, no, just a moment. You'll be here in one moment. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Can you hear me?
Let's see. Turned on.
Can you hear me? Yes,
Yes, we
excellent.
can.
Sorry for that. Technique is important. We've experienced and learned a lot during COVID, but apparently many things can go wrong. Thank you, IDLO, for co-organizing this event with us. It's, to say the least, an important topic. I'm very honored, as I started or tried to say before, to open this event, which is an important event on gender justice and climate change during the Stockholm Plus 50. With Sweden's feminist foreign policy as a backdrop, Sida inherently aims to integrate gender as such, gender equality, environment and climate, and always apply a human rights-based approach in all our work. And from our, and I think everyone's gender analysis, we know that women and girls are at the forefront of transformative climate change. And yet, as was pointed out by Jan, and yet we know that women and girls are underrepresented in environmental decision-making, which undercuts the democratic nature of these processes. Climate change is a problem which needs political and social solutions. While the world is discussing how to reduce emissions, sea levels are rising, temperatures are soaring, causing floods and droughts and devastating communities all around the world. Women and children constitute 80% of those displaced by climate change. And with migration patterns changing, women and children and LGBTQI communities are more likely to be subject to severe consequences of climate change. It is important. It's therefore important, but not only therefore, it's also a human right, but it is important that everyone, also women, girls, and the LGBTQI community, are given influence and voice in decision-making processes. Women are still the main providers of small-scale agriculture production, and often without owning land or without access to finance and other services. Women often carry a heavy burden in the so-called care economy, ensuring the livelihoods and survival of billions of families, billions of people. A fact which is often forgotten or maybe ignored is the fact that women are often fast to adapt to change. They innovate, so to say, to survive, and respond to climate challenges in ways possible. Despite all this, women rarely find themselves at the negotiating table of climate change issues or biodiversity for that sake. The enhancement of present policies and engendering of decision-making processes on climate change from global to the local level is vital to ensure that the solutions to the climate crisis are inclusive and comprehensive. As a development partner, Sida engages and we also finance organizations that support women in communities at all levels of society. And the reason is, of course, to make it possible for them to better understand the situation, to analyze problems, and design solutions inclusive of legislative change. And this is, of course, because a feminist perspective on climate change can lead the way to concrete change. We must grant women and women's organizations, gender activists and marginalized groups their human right to participate in research, in policy making, and in crafting of solutions and being part of the decision making. Their knowledge, their understanding will allow for real, sustainable solutions. It is encouraging that the recent CSW 66 conference emphasized far-reaching statements that will ensure a role for women, girls and marginalized groups, such as indigenous women, to be part of the continued process on climate change. A gender action plan is already being implemented under the Paris Agreement, but, of course, much remains to be done. In concluding, I would also like to remind all of us, maybe unnecessary, but still, there is still a strong resistance to gender equality and women's rights. We have to fight, and we have to fight hard against the resistance so that we do not backtrack in the gains that have been accomplished in the last decades. With rapid climate change, we cannot afford to slide backwards when what we should do is be charging forward. As development partners, we have the privilege to change power dynamics by supporting those at the front line of climate change, and that we will certainly do. Thank you very much for listening, and welcome to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carin, very much for your remarks and for your partnership. I think that your remarks and the remarks of the Minister have set us up perfectly for the discussion, and I'd like now to welcome the panelists onto the stage. Let me introduce Ms. Archana Soreng, member of the Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Dr. Omaira Bolaños, Director of Latin America and Gender Justice at the Rights and Resources Initiative. Come up onto the stage. Ms. Yamide Dagnet, Director of Climate Justice at the Open Society Foundation. And Ms. Lotta Sylwander, Lead Policy Specialist on Gender at Sida. Just a moment, we have another small technical adjustment, please.
Yeah.
Welcome. So, Ms. Soreng, I'd like to address the first question to you. The decisions that we make today will resonate for decades to come and shape the world for future generations. And yet younger people, and particularly young women, are often excluded in policy making, and as Carin has just said, often not at the decision-making tables. They're rarely consulted or given a real voice to shape climate action. So what strategies can be adopted to empower women to realize their environmental rights and fully and effectively participate in efforts to achieve Agenda 2030? Over to you.
Soreng.
Yes?
Yeah.
Well, I think I was just looking at the audience, and I would like to give a huge moment of appreciation. And let's give a huge round of applause for all of us, because we are here present, willing to listen to each one of us. So. I think I would like to start by saying that what is required today for working for women's rights and gender justice is people support. Today, this full house gives me so much of hope and strength, and also makes me feel and see what solidarity looks like. Because it's a full house, everyone is here to learn from each other and to listen from each other. And I often feel there's so much of lack of ability to listen to each other in today's world. There's lack of respect And that's what I feel that in today's world, it's really, really important that we emphasize on the worldview and perspective of women and gender when we talk about climate justice. As a young indigenous woman, I strongly feel that it's really, really important to have representation in the policy making spaces, because even if we talk about indigenous communities and local communities, we need more representation from indigenous youth and indigenous women in general altogether. This also brings down to me to the fact that when we are speaking about climate crisis, indigenous women are the one who are most affected by climate crisis and are the one who are most vulnerable to it. When we talk about impacts of indigenous people, it's much more different with indigenous women, because the responsibility of protection is on indigenous women, the responsibility of being resilient, the responsibility of getting food for the family, even if there is drought, even if there is cyclone, even if it is rain, it comes down to indigenous women. And the resilience which indigenous women have shown over the years is being in the front lines. And when we talk about climate action, if we don't have enabling policies for indigenous women, it is something we are losing out and we are failing out. So I would like to propose that it is really, really crucial that we have gendered climate justice policies in the international arena. At the same time, we have this with proper framework and mechanism as to how it is being implemented. And second, I think in the national level, in the NDCs, we really need strong commitment by the countries on this, ensuring the leadership of indigenous people and local communities, which also brings down to me to the fact that right recognition of indigenous women over the land, forest and territory needs to be highlighted. Women, environmental and land defenders needs to be supported and protected. And at the end, I would like to sum up my intervention at this point of time by saying that indigenous women, indigenous young people, and indigenous young girls needs to be leaders of climate action, not victims of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Archana. Dr. Bolaños, at the Rights and Resources Initiative, you advocate for women to be at the center of decision-making and climate action at the community level. And in your experience, what structural barriers prevent their participation? And how can we catalyze progress on gender equality and climate action at that level?
Thank you. As a global coalition of organizations that is comprised of grassroots women's organizations, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant and local communities, we are committed to support a call that no climate solutions can be successful without putting indigenous, Afro-descendant, or local community at the center of decision makers of climate action. Indigenous and local communities comprise more than half of the 2.5 billion people who relies on the lands, forests, and resources for their livelihoods, for their traditions, for the food security, and they manage over 50% of the world's lands. Women take primary responsibility and preserve lands and resources. However, they do that without the legal security that their male counterparts have. So tenure rights for women are important, and they are seldom recognized by national laws, which left them out of decision-making at all levels, not only at the community level, but at the national and international level, the letter of voice. Women's insecurity of land made them disempowered. So we are supporting also a call for channeling funds to support the recognition of women's rights to access, to own land, and to make decisions on the land. However, women across the world is the one that received the less funding and less technical and political support at all levels. And that's why we as RRI, as a network, are supporting a grassroots movement of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local community across Africa, Asia, and Latin America who are making a strong call for a gender-inclusive finance, climate finance. At the COP, there was a pledge of 1.7 billion to support communities on the ground for the work that they have been doing in conserving and protecting lands and resources. And although that is a very good step forward, we need to ensure two things. First, that funds really goes to the diversity of groups on the ground that are working for us, that are helping us to maintain a healthy environment. And second, that women at the grassroots level have access to those funds. In that regard, our network has making a call to the international donors and the international community to ensure that there is an allocation specifically for grassroots women that addresses many of the agendas that they are moving on the ground without the support of many of the international community. They have received limited support. And what are the calls that they are doing? First, channel funds to mobilize processes that make recognition of women's contributions to climate change and conservation. Funds to enhance women's advocacy and capacity to fight for their tenure rights, their rights to govern, their rights to decide on their land and resources and benefit from them, along with their communities and people. Support women's leadership formation across intergenerational processes. The leadership formation is critical for women at the grassroots level because that helps to transform patterns of discrimination and allow women to gain spaces for participation, to propose their perspectives, to bring new ideas and complement the struggles of their own people. They are also interested in calling for an inclusive participation, not only at the community level, gaining spaces for voices in decision-making, but also the representation at national and international level. We would like and support the claim to have international spaces that are inclusive. In this space, at this conference, we have seen the participation of many indigenous women from different countries, different regions. However, many of them are not being possible to participate in many of the side events and sessions because we need to ensure that these spaces are inclusive. There are no interpretation in many languages, and some of them are lacking the possibility to be right now here with us, listening, learning, or sharing, being able to ask a question of what we are discussing now. So in that regard, we insist climate finance need to devote funds specifically for women and define the type of actions that can be supported, and actions that also support the capacity building of women to manage those funds and make possible their dreams in achieving equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Omaira. I'm now turning to Yamide Dagnet. And Ms. Dagnet, achieving our climate goals will require successfully mobilizing both public and private sources of funding. In your opinion, how can we ensure that investments in climate action address the root causes of injustice and inequality while empowering women and girls? I think this issue has just been raised by our previous speaker. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be in this panel. I am so humbled, and I'm going to try not to echo too much. Well, echoing but not repeating what I heard. But I would say something a little bit provocative in the sense that, over the past 3 decades, I think there's been some missteps in the way we handled climate change and in our approach. It's been very narrow, primarily scientific, very technical, technocratic from A to B, and we lost the touch to the people. And I think this is probably why we have seen a lot of commitments, more commitments, but less implementation on the ground, uneven progress, and failure to distribute some of the benefits of our actions to all, and leaving those most vulnerable behind. So I think, we're here 50 years after, a report was released on the limits to growth. And I think a lot of our approach, to finance, which took center stage, was also our appreciation to one indicator of progress for life, the GDP, right? And losing sight about the quality of life and those who are making that quality feasible, and the women. So I think blended finance really need to be seen as a mobilizer, a lever, and a distributor. That issue of distribution and sharing needs to be at the core to really build that resilience. And for a better quality of life, especially at a time when climate impacts gets just more intense than they were even a year ago. Blended finance real value and impact needs to be people-centered with the justice lens, and it should not be just about deployment of capital. It needs to go, as was said before, it needs to go to supporting more knowledge, cultural, political networks. It's not just about building infrastructure, yes, but those enabling factors are very important as well. And it's not just the technical knowledge, indigenous knowledge as well needs to really get center stage. It's very important to do that to avoid those blind spots, to avoid maladaptation, minimizing unintended impact of even climate measures. Sometimes we intend to do well, in fighting climate, but can have unintended effects and leaving still the same people behind and undermining rights and dignity. So it's very important, to push for this blended finance that needs to actually de-risk, to go where it is needed the most. And this is why I make a plea that, over the past few years, we've seen a lot of attention to reducing emission, talking about gigatons. It's about the people and the need to actually adapt and tackle all those impacts. It's very important that, if we continue to avoid and to leave our ability to adapt, to climate change, it's as if we're really leaving behind also the women that are really at the front line of adaptation and tackling the climate impacts, for all the reasons that you heard. And at COP26, countries have promised to double finance for adaptation. And we really need to see that happening. And I hope that we will see some good signals from the G7, but also the private sector. Very often, adaptation is not very appealing for private sector because it's not profitable. There's not a lot of returns. And this is why we need governments, grants, and philanthropy to work together to de-risk, those such investments. So just, to summarize and to say, let's make sure that we see those pledges come through. But also let's make sure that we support through those pledges the whole ecosystem, feminist ecosystem. People like my dear panelists, also all those women in the parliamentarian sector, all the women in media. We need to look at, all of those sectors, all the entrepreneurs, to really support them. It's not just one sector. It's not just, some of the farmers. So, and also to make sure that feminism is also well understood. It's probably clear for us, but we still need to do more in communicating and in translating, and what this means. And the last is legal empowerment. This is all it is about. Let's make sure that those women, that ecosystem is protected. At the end of the day, there's still the number of climate defenders being killed every year is still rising. So let's make sure that those on the front line are protected, are empowered for the whole using the whole legal value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Yamide. I'd now like to turn to Ms. Lotta Sylwander. Sweden has championed a feminist foreign policy since 2014. How is this translated into your work in the development sector? And what lessons have you learned that can help us promote gender equality while tackling the climate crisis?
Thank you, Jan. Not an easy question, but let me first of all quote one of my human rights mentors that I met many years ago. He said, "Never mistake the law for justice." And I think that lies kind of, it kind of resonates with everything that we heard here today. And so why do I mention this? Well, because I think the law in general, globally, even nationally, does not take into account the role and the responsibilities of women, and particularly not indigenous women. And the law doesn't take into account the change agent role that many women play in climate change work across the world. And we know, as many of us have said already, that women are really at the forefront of the adaptation to climate change, but also finding solutions and leading communities in their resilience and response and adaptation to climate change. And we know that rural and indigenous women are the key agents for achieving transformational economic and environmental and social change that is required for sustainable development. And this applies on all levels, whether it's individual, household, or national level. However, this development is often hindered by social norms, traditional beliefs, power dynamics in communities, in households, and even nationally or in smaller groups in society. Even legislation and national policies hinder women from being part of decision-making and hinders them from exercising their role as change agents because of that lack in the legislation. Yesterday, maybe some of you attended a meeting with judges who are environmental change agents, if you like. And we heard that the judges are the last mile in terms of ensuring good governance and the rule of law on environment. They also expressed a need to be educated, informed, and trained on climate change and on environmental issues so that they can be that independent voice of the judiciary when it comes to environment. I would add that they also need to understand the feminist perspective on climate change to achieve that integrity, and that is necessary for the judiciary to have. Sida's overall objective is to support and create better living conditions for people living in poverty and in oppression. All of Sida's development cooperation is based on a rights perspective, and poor people's, and particularly women's and girls' perspective on development, inclusive of climate change and environment, of course. So, as many of you know, we have Sweden has a feminist foreign policy, which of course gives Sida as an agency the political support necessary to be a strong advocate for feminist climate change. Good governance and the rule of law from a feminist perspective is essential to Sida's support and also essential to our understanding of finding and supporting solutions to climate change. So women and girls, together with indigenous people and especially indigenous women, make out the majority of the poor, the neglected, the oppressed, and those who suffer, and they suffer disproportionately from climate change. Therefore, at Sida, we believe that climate and environmental work is an important prerequisite for reducing poverty and must be conducted in the form of advocacy, targeted initiatives, and integration into all Sida's operational activities. We also actively work to change gender norms and have a continuous dialogue with partners, with governments that we work with, and others. So a gender-sensitive policy development, I think, is crucial, or we believe is crucial, and has to be done in parallel with local action. So an integrated and inclusive participation of everyone in society and the community can be established. In order to change the underlying and systemic barriers to women's participation in climate change, which is limited by social norms, by power relations, we need to do this together. We need all the organizations, we need IDLO, we need the Sidas of this world, we need the judiciary and the judges, so that we can erase one of the main barriers to climate justice, which is social norms that is stopping this change from taking place. Changing social norms is one of the most difficult things you can do, as we all know if we ever try to change ourselves in any way. When the environment is falling apart, it is very easy to ignore the efforts to empower women and indigenous people, and we cannot afford that. Hence, the process and the struggle for women's empowerment has to go hand in hand with climate change and adaptation and resilience. Several of Sida's supported programs have proved to be impactful in changing attitudes and social norms and supporting climate change adaptation. So Sida will continue to support the building of gender-informed legal frameworks, as well as policies and institutions that are enabling women's and marginalized people's participation and voice. Institutions and the legal framework should be supportive of women's ability to make a living, exercise their rights, and strengthen their resilience. A strong and independent and effective justice sector are indeed crucial for democracy and sustainable development, and frankly, crucial to saving the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, as Archana said at the beginning, we have listened to each other, and I'm sure we have learned. We've identified some issues. We've heard some needs. And I think one of the recurring messages from this Stockholm Plus 50 is the need to turn words and commitments into concrete action and sustainable initiatives. So before we end this panel, I'd really like to ask each of you, if you had a magic wand, what is one transformative action that you'd like to see that could promote a feminist climate justice? I'm going to start with you, Archana.
I think. Hello. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think if I had one magic band, I would probably do that people stop denial and start acceptance that it's really crucial to have women on board, because It's very sad, but it's the reality. We still have to fight and advocate to make sure that it's crucial for women to be part of the processes. The second thing which I feel it's really crucial is also to understand that how every women across the globe in all the diversity are playing a crucial role towards climate action and also are being affected by climate crisis. Because I truly would like to give a short example. Like, I come from a place where when we have cyclones in our regions, the coastal areas are affected, and the women of the coastal areas are affected because they're losing their livelihood and home. But at the same time, women in the central area where there's no ocean or river are also affected because of the mere drop of rain. And sometimes you can feel, how is a mere drop of rain very harmful? But actually the mere drop of rain is also harmful because it spoils the agriculture products, it spoils the farming practices, it spoils the forest-based livelihood, and the entire livelihood is at stake for the women in the central area also. And when this happens regularly in a recurring basis, it is making indigenous women, local women more vulnerable. And that's why I feel it's really important for us to understand that how everyone is being affected differently and needs attention. And that's why we need a holistic approach to this issue of climate action rooted with gender justice.
Thank you. Stop the denial. Yes, Omaira, what's your transformative action?
I think we want all that the contribution of grassroots women to their communities, to the local economies, are recognized. We understand and always think that economic empowerment leads to political empowerment. How that opens the path to have a voice, to have a perspective. And when we support initiatives at the growth level for women, we also are supporting women's own perspectives and initiatives in terms of how they are building a future, not only for themselves, but for their communities and for their families. And they became then empowered to be leaders instead of being recipients or beneficiaries of others' thinking. So that's what we want, a woman that is totally empowered and decide and propose how and what to do.
Great. Yamide, one action.
It's a little bit provocative, but if I had a magic wand, I would make all the leaders of the world women. The balance 90%, 10%. And another thing that I would have liked is just to see us making quick decisions. I think we have seen that we can make quick decisions when it comes to military, but it would be, we have talked about things for a long time now. It's really time to get into action. So I would love to see, those planning for roadmap of 3 years become 3 weeks. So that's something that I would like to see, including finance.
Okay, Lotta, one action.
So can I add up all the wands and then I add mine? I think I would use my wand to make every government in the world understand that good governance is actually taking climate change and environment seriously and delivering and not stalling anymore, and understanding that women, girls, and indigenous people constitute the real change agents in this process.
Well, I think we have some excellent ideas here. And to help us close out this very interesting session, we're going to be joined by two speakers who will provide some reflections on our discussion today and look ahead to the future. And first, I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Camila Zepeda, Director General for Global Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and I would also have a want to make all women leaders. I do believe that's necessary to change this world. And we've heard that we can't have denial and that we need to empower women and have women at the front of the decision-making processes. And we need that. We see that in the international arena, in climate and biodiversity negotiations, that we're only 21% of head negotiators are women. I'm fortunate to be one of them. I'm Mexico's lead climate and biodiversity negotiation. Mexico has a feminist foreign policy. And we're a team of young women making that difference because we're passionate about it. I see here it's an event of women and girls, and the audience is mainly women and girls. We're talking among ourselves, and we know this, but men need to listen. There's a few. I'm happy that you're here, but it should be an audience full of men. They're the ones that need to listen to this. We know it. And we need to have ourselves put in those positions, because otherwise it doesn't get the importance it deserves. I keep hearing over and over in all of the negotiations that I participate that gender is a minor issue. I mean, we've had bigger things that we need to deal. Finance, of course, finance. Article 6, of course, Article 6. And biodiversity. I mean, there's so many things that it always gets diluted. It always gets postponed. And it's a transversal issue because we do have a more differentiated impact, but we can also make a difference because we think differently, we are more empathetic, and we can have the change that we need. And so just going forward, I would ask all of you to push your governments to make sure that they have this gender agenda. We've seen over and over that negotiations are not taking as seriously this topic as they should. In climate change, the gender action plan that was mentioned was almost not approved because in Madrid it was seen as not an important issue that we had maybe 2 more years, 3 more years, 5 more years, and it wasn't an idea that it is an urgent matter, and it is. And it was only because there were a few of us women there making sure that that didn't happen, that we now have a gender action plan that will translate into much needed policies. But in biodiversity right now, I was in Geneva a couple weeks ago, and again, all of the gender responsive policies, all of the gender perspective language was being diluted over and over. So it came to a few countries that we have feminist foreign policy to say we need at least then a gender equality target. It still hasn't been discussed, but just so you know, please ask your negotiators to support the gender equality target, because we need it. We needed to make a change. We needed to have then the policies that will finally give us the rights that we deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to have to ask you to excuse me because I have to run to the plenary to make the statement of my organization, which I think is important in terms of getting it on the record. I'm going to turn over the moderation to Ilaria Botelero, who is our Director of Research and Learning at IDLO, and thank all of the speakers, and Ilaria will introduce our final speaker. Ilaria, you have this.
Thank you, Director General, and sorry about this slight change, but the plenary is calling our organization. And I am very pleased now to call and welcome Ms. Sarah Hendriks, who is the Director of the Policy Program and Intergovernmental Division of UN Women, to provide final remarks for us. Sarah, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. What a powerful panel this has been. This has truly been a highlight for me here at Stockholm Plus 50, and I hope all of you feel the same. I'm just absolutely honored and humbled to follow Camila in offering some concluding remarks to this important side event today that's been co-organized by IDLO together with Sida, the government of Peru, UN Women and Generation Equality and Rights and Resources. I'd also just like to acknowledge the leadership of the government of Mexico and together with France in making the Generation Equality Forum a reality that's galvanizing action, a feminist, an unapologetically feminist approach to climate justice. Unapologetically feminist and unapologetically rights-based. I'd love to just acknowledge with admiration the incredibly powerful points that came from this panel. Wow. And I will attempt to provide us with a very quick summary of some of these powerful highlights. We heard from Carin from Sida, who highlighted to us a fact often forgotten or ignored is that women are fast to adapt to change. And she said, with rampant climate change, we cannot slide backwards. We should be heading forward. Archana, thank you. Your powerful words reminded us that Indigenous women and young people and girls must be leaders of climate actions, not victims of it. And you challenged us very concretely to listen. You talked about solidarity and intentional listening, and that matters in order to deliver and drive change. Omaira, thank you for your comments. You talked about economic empowerment and how it leads to political empowerment. And you unabashedly highlighted that Indigenous and local communities must be at the center of climate solutions. And you talked about funding and how those solutions need funds in order to thrive. Thank you for that truth. Yamide, thank you for your highlights, highlighting for us that these last 30 years have provided relatively narrow scientific approaches to climate change that has led to uneven progress, that has led to progress that has left many behind. And you highlighted for us that blended finance needs to be seen as a mobilizer and a distributor at its core to build resilience and better quality of life for all. One of many, many things you mentioned. And Lotta, who highlighted one of your leaders, I think, who you quoted, never mistake the law for justice. We are at an event, of course, all about feminist climate justice through the rule of law. And Lotta emphasized to us the need to understand that good governance is taking environment and climate into consideration, and that women, girls, and Indigenous people are the real agents of change in this process. Thank you, Lotta, for those words. And I'd like to also close by just highlighting with appreciation the leadership of IDLO. IDLO is not only a champion on the urgency for equality of law and gender justice institutions, but is also a commitment maker to the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Thank you to IDLO for all that you do to ensure that the rule of law bolsters a feminist approach to climate action. And I think we've heard today how gender-informed legal frameworks matter and how we need to strengthen those normative as well as policy frameworks to be cognizant of every single point that has been highlighted on today's panel. To take into consideration laws and policies related not just to climate, but to environment, to natural resources, to land, to water, to energy. To note that all of those things matter to women and girls because women and girls are at the center of all of those things. We've been reminded today that although women and girls in all their diversity, in all our diversity, have been at the forefront of movements demanding climate and environmental justice at every level, whether at local or national or at global levels, their voice and agency and participation, and especially leadership, often goes unrecognized, unsupported, undervalued, and especially under-resourced. We have heard that this under-resourcing is significant. In fact, just 0.02% of climate finance is directed to women's rights organizations, to organizations comprised of girls, of young women, of indigenous women working at the forefront of solutions. And women, and especially young women and girls organizations, face multiple barriers, from shrinking civic space, from increasing illiberal democracies, from diminishing funds, from funds that are incredibly complex and hard to access, also to threats of physical violence, to threats of their own security as environmental human rights defenders. In fact, many young people I spoke with last evening reminded me that they are even afraid of COP27 and of being on a stage where they feel that their security may not be guaranteed. And I think this is a legitimate concern. It is even more acute for Indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, older women, LGBTQI+ women, women with disabilities, migrant women, those living in rural areas, or who have very little access to communication or information. I think we heard also in the opening comments from Jan some very powerful data points about how women and girls' leadership is really critical to make climate, environment, and disaster risk governance more effective. And let me just remind us of a couple of those points because they're hard-hitting and I think very convincing. Greater representation of women, including young women in all their diversity in national parliaments, has shown to be better for the planet, leading countries to adopt more stringent climate change policies, resulting in lower carbon emissions. Increasing women's participation in natural resource management is associated with better resource governance and conservation outcomes. And the application of gender quotas enhances conservation and climate interventions and leads to more equal sharing of benefits for the whole planet. As we draw this session to a close, allow me just to say that it is the tenacity, but also the resilience, and frankly, the brilliance of the women that you've heard from today that we all need to listen to. It is this type of vision that is grounded in lived realities, that is unapologetic about a feminist climate justice lens that will translate into transformative change. And as we look forward from Stockholm Plus 50 to COP27, it is my urgent plea that we all take forward these words shared with us today and think about how to imbue them into our own actions and steps. In wherever you are, in whatever you do, whatever place you are on this planet, to think about what was said today and imbue it with your action and your change. And with this, we thank you for being here today, and we thank especially this wonderful panel.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your remarks, very kind words. Thank you, and inspiring for all of us, especially. And I would like also to thank all of our speakers for their participation in this discussion today. You have inspired us, you have empowered us, you have given us concrete recommendations to move forward. In fact, these concrete lessons and recommendations that you share today are an essential part of strengthening the evidence base to help transform laws and institutions and to develop feminist approaches to climate action. Climate change is an issue of intergenerational justice, and our actions today will affect not just the present, but especially the future generations. And gender is a core climate issue, and climate justice must be a priority for all feminists. IDLO, together with its partners, is committed to working with all of you to empower women and girls and champion their leadership and their agency. So thank you again for having joined this event today. It has been a pleasure to have you all. Also on behalf of my Director General, Jan Beagle, IDLO, and all of our partners, thank you and have a good continuation of Stockholm +50.